So what I'd like you to talk about is I guess we can describe it as the hierarchy within the G7, because there are two ways of looking at it. One way is to say that there are these, again, if we put on our tinfoil hats, that these are these international elites. They surpass the interests of any particular country, even in the G7. They have their own interests and they're not particularly attached to any of these countries. But a more traditional way of looking at it would be to say that the G7 essentially does the bidding of the United States, the most prominent member. I mean, initially it used to be the most important economy, especially when this organization was first established in the middle of the 1970s. So do you think that, well, first of all, how would you look at this hierarchy? It doesn't seem to be an equal partnership. It seems to be America first in terms of well, maybe not the interests of average Americans, but the interest of the American elites. And then if there is some kind of a trickle-down effect going to other countries that would benefit from that sort of neoliberal integration that you described, yes, then they would benefit. But these days, it seems that it's almost like in some ways there's a lot of damage coming from this organization, especially since the escalation in 2022. How do you look at it?
Yes, I think that the United States simply doesn't know any kind of equal partnership. I don't think it has ever established an equal partnership, even since the 19th century, as a matter of fact. We all remember, for example, the Monroe Doctrine, which was the idea of American to the Americans. But, well, I'm also American. We from South America are also American. At the beginning, Simon Bolivar, for example, used to think that when the President Monroe was talking about American for the Americans, it was meant as for everyone. But then eventually they understood that they consider themselves the Americans. So the United States simply doesn't know equal partnership. Of course, if it's convenient, and it was convenient, for example, during the Cold War to avoid the spreading of communism and also avoid the spreading of patriotic or nationalistic movements or parties especially in Latin America or Africa, Middle East, and also in Europe, of course. And even in the 90s, when they thought that the world history had already ended and they imposed the Washington Consensus, for example, there was the perspective of everyone more or less benefiting from these arrangements, though, of course, the Americans, the United States, always profiting more than the others. But when we see a world crisis is when we see that yes, there's a hierarchy where the United States is, of course, first, and the other nations are in second place or third place or fourth place, depending on the country, as a matter of fact. Because, of course, if we are taking a look at Germany, they are clearly treated worse than even France or the United Kingdom. Both Germany and Italy are countries where they still keep a lot of bases and where they keep most of their soldiers in Europe. So it's basically occupied countries, just like Japan. If we read G7 from the standpoint of history, we see that it's basically a coalition of the United States and, of course, other countries, where three of these countries are occupied countries, are basically colonies of the United States, then that have very little of independence in foreign affairs. I remember that President Putin, in one of maybe in one of the Valdai speeches, talked about how he was told by some European leaders that they are all being spied upon and blackmailed, and that they actually can do almost nothing against the United States because they have no actual freedom. But and of course, there's this perspective that see from the standpoint of global elite. And it's in some sense it's true, because there is it's part of the development of capitalism, and I associate what we call globalism as in more or less Leninist terms as something as another kind of stage of development of capitalism. We had imperialism, where we have these national bourgeois elites, because these elites achieved the status of national monopolies in their sectors. But when these monopolies overcome the borders of their own countries, that's when we begin to see the development of what we call globalism. And of course, some of these guys, they you can have a billionaire in the United States who marries um, uh, I don't know, a Japanese heiress, and a guy in France who marries a Brazilian member of an oligarchic family, etc. And everything begins to be more or less mixed among these elites, but there are differences among them, because these elites, they still have their own intentions, or at least the pretension to become the central, the focus point of this this building of a global world government or whatever. We see clearly in France, for example, where Macron obviously has his own model of globalism, where it isn't the United States and McDonald's and Coca-Cola the pattern of world culture and the world values, but the values of the French Revolution, of Illuminism, of this republican idea that the French defend. So that there exists a global elite, and at the same time differences among these elites, which become clearer whenever there's a crisis. That's what we have been seeing now. We also see that with the German elites, we simply don't seem to care really about their own country, and who insist on trying to pressure their own government into a conflict with Russia. It's even clearer with the United Kingdom, which is much more radical in their belligerence than even the United States. Most of what we have seen from provocations against Russia have actually mostly begun in London than in Washington. Of course, maybe London is acting as an outsourced agent of the United
Chihuahua.
States. A chihuahua, yes, but yes, maybe they had. It's an attempt at recovering world protagonism, because as we have seen, the United Kingdom, which was attempting at achieving global hegemony in the 19th century, lost everything after the Second World War, and they resent it deeply. They feel a very big resentment against the United States because of that, and that's why they are the biggest provokers against Russia. But yes, I see the hierarchy. I also see that there's a high degree of integration, but that these elites, though they are much more integrated than the peoples of their countries, they also have their differences among them, which is always becoming much clearer whenever there is a crisis.
All roads take to London, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say we've had some cogent arguments on this channel to show that perhaps London is sort of the center as opposed to just a chihuahua, like you've termed it, who is acting upon someone else's orders. And of course, the, let's call them complicated British-Russian relations go back centuries, where there is that antagonism. I mean, we can't forget the fact that the British foreign policy is primarily based on making sure that no serious power arises in the continental part of Europe, whether that would be Germany or Russia, because their entire foreign policy was to sort of instigate conflicts between the powers that were on the rise to make sure that they stay at the top. And of course, these days, as you pointed out, the British Empire no longer exists. Yes, there's sort of the Commonwealth, and Canada, speaking of chihuahuas, likes to officially consider the queen, or now the king, as the head of its state, at least symbolically. But yes, I think there is some resentment there. We might not be seeing it in public. Behind the scenes, though, I suspect it's much, much more serious. So definitely, I agree. I think the UK has been more belligerent towards Russia in the last few years. If you think about, the Kerch Bridge terrorist attack, that would be sort of the most obvious example, but there are others as well. Go ahead.
Just a very interesting fact that I didn't know, of course, because I'm not a historian, someone that studies too much history, but perhaps you can confirm that to me or deny it. Yesterday, I was watching a live stream with Larry Johnson and George Galloway. And at some point, George just mentioned this, it's not by chance that the First World War, 3 of the involved countries were ruled by grandsons of Queen Victoria.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at photographs of, the family of Nicholas II, and their sort of side-by-side images with the British royalty, I mean, they look very, very closely related. I mean, they were also related to the German rulers. So just a couple weeks prior to the official start of World War I, they're writing letters to each other saying "Dear Nicky" and "Dear Willie." The German and the Russian resemble each other less than the English and the Russian sort of ruling families, but the resemblance is definitely there. It's actually pretty uncanny. Yeah, it's definitely not a surprise. But there are other sort of quasi-conspiracy theories. For instance, there's the assassination of Paul, who was, a Tsar, or supposed to be a Tsar, that many people believe had links to Britain, although it is considered a conspiracy theory. Some people would say that it's been proven beyond the reasonable doubt, as people in the court of law would say in the US, that perhaps that did happen. I'm going to refrain from sharing an opinion. I would have to look into that question further. But it's definitely something that goes back centuries, as opposed to the relationship between the US and Russia was pretty good in the 19th century. I mean, we talked about this a little bit on this channel. Of course, at that stage, the United States was not a superpower. And I would sort of make the comment about the Monroe Doctrine a little bit more nuanced, because the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which was in 1904, was definitely very, very brazen in terms of saying that the United States not only should intervene, let's say economically, but militarily in the affairs of its backyard. This was with Teddy Roosevelt. But the initial Monroe Doctrine, which was, the early 1800s, it was actually the trigger for it was Russian expansion in North America. So Russia was not just expanding into Alaska. It had, something like Fort Ross in California. So the Americans were actually almost like more threatened by Russia on the west coast of North America than they were threatened by other sort of powers that have been here previously, like Spain and France. So that was so in their opinion, it was defensive. I think these days we can look at it and say, yes, it was defensive because the country was new and still fairly weak, but the roots of this as our continent, and we consider ourselves Americans, and we're going to ignore all those other Americans that live south of us. I think the roots were definitely there, but I would say it was still much more defensive than the thing that came in 1904, which is the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And that's, that particular document instigated, or I would say justified, a lot of the so-called interventionism in, Cuba and Nicaragua, et cetera, and, many other countries. I think we'll do a separate episode on that.